Hello and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Julia Golding. I'm an author, but I also run the activities of our centre. And joining me today is my good friend Jacob Renneker, who is sitting over in Seattle. And Jacob is an expert on Tolkien, but also works within the games industry, and obviously knows about fantasy from the putting it on a board and getting you to play with it side of things as well. Is that fair to say, Jacob?
Yeah, completely fair.
Good. All right. So there's a new game in town or a new film in town, which some of you might already have heard about, but you'll now hear a lot more, which is at the end of the year, there is going to be a new Lord of the Rings film. No, this isn't The Hunt for Gollum. That's some way off. This is an anime version of the War of the Rohirrim. Now, some of you may be scratching your heads thinking, where is the War of the Rohirrim in Lord of the Rings? So I'm going to pass that one over to you, Jacob. If people want to know the source material for this film, where should they look?
So you have to, it's in the books that you have of Lord of the Rings, actually. So you probably already have it, but you have to flip all the way to the end of The Return of the King in Appendix A. And then once you get to Appendix A, you have to keep flipping until you get to the
Okay.
House of Earl. So yeah, so keep going, very, very end. And so yeah, so it's in Appendix A at the end of Return of the King
And it's
as
called
it's going
the
through the
House,
different kingdoms.
and it's called the House of Earl, not the War of the Rohirrim, because the War of
Exactly.
the Rohirrim is the chosen title for this film. So that is not a novel. What you have there is, I think, 3 pages, more or less. Plus, there is one of these Tolkienian timelines where it goes through the dates for the Rohirrim, which actually has a lot of little details within it, which aren't in the prose 3 pager. So do read on past the prose 3 pager. Would you like to just sketch out what the House of AL is in terms of that 3 page? It's a summary, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a summary because it's trying to this is something that to tease a future podcast on Tolkien's letters, something that's interesting, like, understanding Tolkien's purposes and the publisher's purposes for putting in this material, because there's so much, as you know, reading through Lord of the Rings, there's so much history that is implied, that the characters speak about, places that they visit, right, artifacts, buildings, areas, place names, and so there was a desire to put more of that out without including the entire Silmarillion into
Yeah.
with the entire Lord to publish it with Lord of the Rings, which is what Tolkien preferred. And so the compromise was adding some appendices that could put relevant portions of the history. And this was so difficult for Tolkien to say, like, hey, what is most important from this entire span of history that I've created for this entire world. And so the appendix there, so this is kind of highlighting significant elements from the larger legendarium that he felt shed particularly relevant light on the happenings of Lord of the Rings, particularly. So we have elements in there like the House of Gondor, going through the history there. And so this is kind of coming after that broader history. It also, you have your history that Numenor, of course, is coming into play there and weaving in and out of that. So that's where this is. And so summarizing, so it's coming after, it's not the first element from the appendices. There's with Appendix A, there's a number of other kingdoms and peoples that it's kind of following trajectories and kind of snippets from larger background material. But this one, yeah, so this is going specifically from House of Earl and how the Rohirrim kind of become established, where they're living, how they even came into came into a peoplehood to be called a Rohirrim, and then kind of the waxing and waning of their kingdom, different forces that came in tried to right so how even when they came in themselves, who was pushed out, right? So we have people that existed and were living in that land, um uh
The Dunlendings.
yes, the Dunlendings, right? So these are and they're Dunlendings, and this is interesting. I think for the purpose of this conversation, this and the film is the primary antagonists for this particular section that they're going to be. So it's a sliver of something that is happening within the entire scope of the Kingdom of Rohan. This is one particular several year stretch of time within that where the primary antagonists are the Dunlendings. And so these are people who were descendants of humans who did not leave for Numenor at the beginning of the Second Age. So the people kind of stayed behind, and they were settled in this area, and then are eventually pushed out thanks to Numenorians kind of coming in, displacing them, Rohan becoming settled in the area. And so these are people who are actually, you could say, indigenous to that area, or they were first. I wouldn't say necessarily indigenous. If anyone, there's nothing that's completely indigenous, but they're people who are right. So we're kind of like who have had a long standing relationship with the area, who have been living in the area, who then kind of get displaced by Rohan, and then are kind of trying to work their way back into the lands that they feel
So
they
So
belong
let's
to.
connect this to the films. I'm not sure. I think it's only in the extended version, but if you have seen the extended version, there is a scene in, I think, in the Two Towers where Saruman is walking amongst a lot of hairy guys with sort of torches, and he says, the Horse Lords have stolen your lands, and it's your time to take it back." And then you see them sort of invading, and along with not just the Saruman's orcs who are attacking, these people are also involved. So there is a potential here for a narrative about waves of colonization and colonialism. It's
Mhm.
well, maybe it is colonialism, but as a UK person raised on history about how Britain happened, it's very familiar. So we have in our sort of first century after Christ, we have waves of people coming in over the North Sea and the Channel, who then settle different parts of particularly England and then push other people further and further over. So that's where the Angles and the Saxons come from. So this idea, I think that's probably what Tolkien is thinking, because that's the kind of school education he would have had as well, that the creation of kingdoms is these waves of people traveling in and taking over other lands, sometimes intermarrying, sometimes warfare. It's a very mixed picture. So it feels very familiar to me, this story. The trajectory here is rather, in the UK, you think of it as people coming in from a sort of southeast and eastern direction. Rohan, they're coming in from the northeast. So they're dropping down through. So if you think of your map of Middle Earth and you think of the spine of the Misty Mountains, the people of Rohan are coming in at the top of the map and dropping down on the eastern side of those mountains, um, and then forming a friendship with the people of Gondor, who are like they're like the Anglo-Saxon kings. They're the chief guys of the region. And they form an alliance because they come to help them in the Battle of Celebrant. So that's the sort of history background. And Rohan, just to connect it in case you're still scratching your head and thinking, who are these guys? They are the horse culture, who in the films, you've got the wonderful Bernard Hill, who died recently. He's King Theoden, and his nephew, Aemma, who's the next king, and Eowyn, Theoden's niece, is the one who kills the Witch King. It's that group of people. But this film isn't about that war. It's going to be set, I kind of like halfway up the history line, because if you look at the connection of the kings, you've got Eorl, as you've heard, coming in and settling. And then Tolkien says in his source material, and the king about whom other stories are told is Helm. Now, we've heard about Helm before, haven't we? Where have somebody who's watched the film heard about Helm?
Yeah, there's a particular location. The name should, yeah, the sound of the name should sound familiar. That's Helm's Deep, where
Mm.
we have in the Two Towers, the film you would have seen, a great deal of action happening there. So this place is named after this Helm Hammerhand is his full full name. I don't think people necessarily called him Mr. Hammerhand, but
King.
that's what he's referred to here. Yeah, King Hammerhand.
Yeah. King Helm. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not sure. Yeah, I suppose he must have been. So, in terms of his not an immediate generation, it would be like, say, we're taking the current royal family in the UK. It would be like talking about an ancestor of theirs back in Tudor times. There's quite a lot of
Mm.
generations and quite a lot of years past. But he is regarded as being the great hero. After the founding king, Earl, and that's where you get Shadowfax and the Miras and all that legend of the horses. But they're more like mythic, whereas Helm is more historical. If you can sort of feel the difference between those two. Okay, so that's these 3 pages do produce a lot of material. So let's before we look at what they might be doing, let's talk about why it's being made and who is making it. So the answer to why it's being made, there is one cynical answer, which is New Line and Warner Brothers need to keep hold of the rights. And part of that is to carry on making Lord of the Rings films. They're not yet ready to start again and do another Lord of the Rings films, in the same way as Sony keeps on making Spider-Man films to keep the rights. They are mining the appendices to Lord of the Rings for this source material. And I presume the choice of doing an animated film means that they felt it was going to cost less and they could keep their rights ticking along. So that's the practical commercial side of it, because I'm not sure there was a huge demand out there, make a
For
Borat.
a Helm Hammerhand,
No,
yeah, biopic, yeah.
yeah. But on the other hand, it does have a relationship with the team who made Lord of the Rings, because Philippa Boyens, who was the one of the 3 screenwriters on that one, along with Peter Jackson and Fran Walsh, is sort of part of the team on this one. And she is teamed up with a younger generation of writers. Let's get their names correct. And that is, let me just check. Yes. Her daughter, I believe, Phoebe Gittins, if I got that right, and her
Yep.
daughter's partner, Arty Papageorgiou. So that is quite an interesting choice in and of itself, is that they're thinking of involving within the family, literally, but a new generation of writers. Um, and the filmmaker on the sort of actual producing the anime style is Kenji Kamiyama. And I was looking at his filmography, and I think he was last most sort of famously associated with a spin-off of the Blade Runner universe called Black Lotus, which I'm afraid I don't know much about. So I'm not a great consumer of anime. I don't know if this has come across your desk at all, or your screen, Jacob.
No, no, I'm not as well versed there as I will be before December comes.
Yeah.
So
So I'm not sure how important the anime part of this is. Because there could be, I mean, people could be out there saying there's a whole history of anime films, um, which I need to be educated about. But we've seen other animations, attempts to animate Lord of the Rings, of course. But I think noticing the style of anime and looking at the sort of treatment of war, you're getting something which is quite well, it's not exactly comic book. It's closer to reality. The way they're using underlying performances, voice actors and faces to sort of inform their characters. So it's not like they're completely surreal fantasy figures like in the
Right.
original Lord of the Rings, the Bakshi version cartoon.
Right.
I think it's got a more of a closer association with a sense of real world speed of movement and human body proportions and all that kind of thing.
Right. And
There is very little actually released yet about how it's going to look. But that's
right.
the few that shots I've seen, that's what it suggests.
Right. And there is definitely to the anime style, there is a sort of dynamism and a sort of kind of like heightened reality to a certain point. So definitely because this is action, they're going to be able to use some visuals that you can't do if you're doing kind of like a hyper realistic um, form. Some of the angles, some of, yeah, the expressions are definitely going to be more stylized than at certain points to heighten the mood and movement. So yeah, that's so this will be really interesting. I know that's yeah one of the things that has been mentioned is that the story here fits. One of the reasons to choose anime is because the certain dynamic for action sequences, and this there will be a good deal of action here. But also another reason is that the anime medium. If somebody is a fan of Tolkien, the kind of intersection between fans of anime fantasy and Tolkienian broader fantasy, there's a good deal of overlap. So this isn't a completely foreign medium
Yeah.
for many fans of Tolkien.
Yeah, and absolutely. I'm sure there are listeners out there who know far more about this than we do. So I'd be really interested when we see a bit more of the visuals. We're not yet able to really judge. Be very interested to hear what you think about it and how what direction they've taken. Um, and of course, we must mention the cast because the cast tells us what line they've taken through the story. We've got Brian Cox, famous from Succession, amongst other things, as Helm Hammerhand. We've got Gaia Wise as his daughter, who's a they've given her the name Hera, which they've invented for her because she is unnamed in the Tolkien three-pager. We've got Luke Pasqualino as Wolf, who is the um, well, we'll get into the story in a second. And we've got Sean Dooley as Freka, who is Wolf's father. And we've got Lawrence Ubong Williams as Frealaf Hilderson, who is the Aylmer figure in this. He is the nephew who comes in at the end. It is a tragedy, potentially this nexus of characters, because there are lots of people die. Um, and I've written in my notes, this feels a bit like House of the Dragon with horses, because there is a lot of inter-family ruthlessness going on. But interestingly, we also have Miranda Otto as Eowyn, which who isn't alive at this time, and it suggests they're giving her a narratorial role to make the connection to the Lord of the Rings, fandom. One wonders if she's going to be doing like a kind of Galadriel preface type introduction. It'd be interesting to see what they do with that character. Because if you do read the appendices, you will find out that after the end of Lord of the Rings, she is happily ever after with Faramir in Ithilien. So one can imagine her telling these stories to her own children. I'd love it if we kind of had a glimpse of that. Just
Yeah,
we always
if you
like
yeah
to
you
see what
actually see
happens
yeah,
afterwards. Yeah. Anyway,
right, and this
that's on my wish
and
list.
I yeah, and I think that the kind of like oral narration that fills like fits well with this culture, right? With
Mm.
this kind of like Anglo-Saxon culture of like oral history, like your Beowulf, that are kind of your oral performances. And so the way that the Tolkien even writes, the way these appendices are presented is very much in line with traditional kind of historical records, where sometimes they'll be giving you a list of kings, and then suddenly there's kind of a detour where they flesh out an entire story, and then kind of go back to the rest of the less notable kings and their happenings. And so the way that it's laid out in the appendices fits very well with kind of a larger kind of oral storytelling tradition. And so I think this is a fun move, a way to connect it for people who are familiar with the films. It gives them a base of kind of like familiarity. They say, oh, I know this character, I know the sound of her voice. And that kind of provides this bridge for those people who aren't familiar with the appendices or the larger
Yeah.
legendarium, kind of helps to ease them into it. So I think that's a brilliant move on their part.
Okay, so what is the story? Um, Thinking if they're going to do a three-act film, like the standard structure, how it breaks down with those characters is as follows. So Helm is at the height of his power, this great man who is this big leader. Um, he has two sons and a daughter, and a rival upstart leader called Freka, who is uh, part Rohirrim, but there also seems to be a suggestion that he is part Dunlending as well. He comes to the council and he asks for Hera's hand in marriage for his son Wolf, which it's suggested as if this is some sort of inappropriate ask. Helm says to him, let's go outside after the meeting and sort this out. And he feels insulted, so he strikes a blow. But because he's Helm Hammerhand, he manages to kill Freka with one blow, which wasn't, I think the feeling is that he's not intending to kill him, but it's like the fatal moment, which then starts up the tragedy in a big way. Um, so we have Wolf the son and Hera, who is our main POV character, according to what we've heard about this film. You presumably need to establish some kind of relationship between Hera and Wolf, whether or not this is something they actually want, or if Hera is being herded into a marriage she doesn't want, and so on. There's lots of choices here. So that's the first act. The second act is Wolf invades 4 years later to get his revenge, and Helm is driven into Helm's Deep, and it's a terrible, terrible winter, a huge suffering across the whole of the region. He loses both of his sons. The daughter isn't mentioned in the Tolkien account. You could make it so that she is now the wife of Wolf, which would give us the point of view, like see it from the other side and the divided loyalties. Or you could mean that you could also write a story where she offers herself as like a sort of peace, I will go and stop him killing all our people. You could make her like a sacrifice, all sorts of things you could do there. So that's an unknown. But anyway, Helm dies standing up in the snow, driven sort of mad by grief. He goes out at night for revenge, and that's quite a dramatic image of him sort of dying, just standing up. He won't ever lie down. That's the image there. And Wolf is in occupation of Meduseld, which is the Golden Hall. And Hera, I'm not quite sure where she is, but that's the kind of low point at the end of the second act. And then the third act, where we get this new chap, Frialaf, the nephew, who is the heir of this story. He's been holding out up in Dunharrow. Now, Dunharrow, for those of you who follow Rohan territories, is the one near the entrance to the Piles of the Dead. It's the one up on the cliff where in the film, Elrond comes to bring the sword to Aragorn, not in the book, in the film. Anyway, he makes a surprise attack on Wolf and kills him in Meduseld and reestablishes his line and brings the body of Helm Hammerhand to Meduseld for a funeral. So that's the end of the last act. Cheerful story, I'm sure you all agree. And there's plenty of scope to work out where Hera fits within it, because we know she's tomboyish, a bit like Eowyn is. And as the main protagonist, she's presumably making some of the story happen. She isn't just a passenger in it. So I don't yet know quite what story levers she is pulling. It's also quite tragic, but so I could see Hera ending up, you know, miserable or dead. But one rather hopes if she could be allowed a future, as Eowyn herself is, that there could be a way out of this and some happiness for her. Be nice if they could find a way of giving it a bit of a bittersweet ending, shall we say. So that's what I see them doing with the material, and I am prepared to be surprised. But if they stick to their source material, that's roughly what they're playing with. They obviously don't have to do it in that order, but that would be an obvious order to do it in. So looking at that outline and story, Jacob, what do you think are the challenges for making us care about it as watchers of this?
Yeah, that's good. And I think the by framing it with Eowyn telling the story, that kind of is a cheat for making us care about it, because this is a character that we care about deeply with the film. And so
Mm.
if this character is telling a story, if she's framing it in a way that the story is meaningful to her, and say perhaps she finds a resonance with this character of Hera, if she identifies with this character and says that, or at least implies that clearly, then us as an audience, we're going to automatically be rooting for that character. So I think that's a way, a sneaky but and convenient but effective way of getting us to care for at least one of the characters, right? From when I was reading the source material itself, it's like Helm just seems like a kind of a jerk and just like rowdy boisterous. Yeah, but he has some real zingers against Freka, right? Who says like oh, so you seem to have grown since the last time, but just in the waistline, just in your belly, am I right? And so there's a few of these different things where, and then it says like everybody in the court laughs. So he's this kind of just like big, gregarious, strong guy who doesn't seem to be terribly compassionate. He's just kind of like life of the party. Kind of, I don't know if this is a good comparison, but something like Thor, how at least in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, how Thor is just, kind of this big, not terribly like sophisticated thinker, but just kind of like can make people laugh and can punch really hard when you need him to. And so so getting us to identify with Helm is, I think, a little bit difficult, but I think this is the reason why they chose Brian Cox to play this character. So in Succession and in X-Men 2, when he plays this military leader who has like a family who is manipulating his own child to wipe out mutants. His child who turns out to be a
Yeah.
mutant to wipe out all mutants. So Brian Cox is play character. So that's that. But then in Succession, it's a father who's working through his children and kind of pulling strings. So he has a history like on screen of being a kind of like a patriarchal strong figure who manipulates his children. And so for people who like that sort of family dynamic, like you were saying, like House of the Dragon, so where Game of Thrones, the family, like intra-family dynamics are a draw. This is something that people who like that sort of dynamic will connect to. That might not be the largest popular audience that might connect with Helm, but like for those people who like that sort of character, it seems like they're really leaning into that with casting Brian Cox in that.
Yeah, so I've called it House of the Dragon with horses, but it could also be Succession with Old English like Beowulf.
Right? Yes.
You could see a version of this, which is like the cynical take on a king manipulating his family. He could perhaps be close to his, I mean, this is speculation, so I won't go too far down this line, but you could imagine it's like rejecting the partnership bid of an upcoming business in the case
Right.
of Freka and his
Yep.
side. So you could see it almost like in business terms.
Hmm.
I can't, the problem for me about this is though there is this tragic, almost like Greek tragedy level of drama in Tolkien's Silmarillion material and in this material, even his choice of telling the ending of Aragorn and Eowyn has this bitter quality to it. It's
Hmm.
definitely there in Tolkien.
Yeah.
My feeling is it's not what Tolkien lovers like about him, that
Yep.
actually we are drawn to his characters like Aragorn, who is a sense of a good leader. We are
Hmm.
drawn to the brave and courageous characters like Eowyn, who will buck the things in society that are keeping her back, and the hobbits, who are these little men with great hearts. That's what makes us love Tolkien, not Turin Turambar and those sorts of
Right.
stories.
Yeah.
So, but you could say that they're taking a punt and they're saying, well, people are used to that kind of Tolkien, but maybe the new generation raised on Game of Thrones would like to see this
Yep. Yeah.
version, sort of
Right.
successions, bear
Yeah.
with succession version of it. Let's give it a
Yep.
go because the resources are at this level. I don't
Yep.
know. I won't like it if that's what they've done. I know I
And
won't.
I don't think, yeah, that's really interesting because like if then comparing to other franchises that have done something similar, so like Star Wars has Rogue One and
Yeah,
Andor. So this seems to be more in those like the lines of like Rogue One is a classic tragedy, right? So like all like I won't spoil the ending well for anyone, but like it's a classic dramatic tragedy. And same with Andor, it's not finished yet, but definitely you see this is something that's exploring um, themes of war, about the complexities, the ambiguities of war, of politics, and this story, and that's a lot of what Tolkien does in the material in Silmarillion is just this, right? So the things that some of the like the bright spots that people remember and love and cling to are the Beren and Luthien, right? This dramatic love story where it actually ends up well, right? So it's kind of a comedy of sorts in the classic
yeah,
definition of the sense, but like, but most of the Silmarillion, right? It's following. It's what Tolkien describes as this, and in the mouth of Galadriel, so the long defeat, right? So this is that history is not meant to be at this like ever increasing progressive, getting happier and brighter. That humanity and the peoples of Middle Earth also kind of in Tolkien's worldview, they're the same. That it's kind of this long defeat, this decline with kind of moments of eucatastrophe, right? With these kind of like unexpected joyful moments, and those
yeah,
unexpected joyful moments and the triumph of um, the human elven, elvish, dwarvish spirit over the kind of relentless uh, press of evil, of sorrow, of sadness, those kind of upsprings, those well springings of moments of joy and happiness and victory that helps to punctuate. And those are only possible because the rest of it is so relentless in its kind of decline. And so this, I think, hopefully, and I would hope that Philippa Boyens, who seems from what she's done with the original film trilogy, um, seems to like really understand that and understand the world. And so I don't think this is just going to be the complete bleakness. I would be surprised if this is just a complete bleak, the wreckage of war, um, and the damage and trauma and that's all that it focuses on without having moments of hope, of happiness, of joy, of unexpected joy. But it definitely on the whole of the scale of say like the Lord of the Rings films that definitely had a more heroic bent. This one, I know that she's said that she wants this to at least explore that idea of like wreckage of war and honor, revenge, family, but as well as one of the things that she has mentioned there is that she wants to focus on resilience. So that's where I think instead of like a overwhelming victory, showing how people can be resilient in these complicated because situations where clearly Rohan is not just the complete unalloyed good guy who has done no wrong. With what Helm does, he clearly does kind of oversteps. Everybody is at fault. And so how do you navigate this landscape where there isn't a clear good, a clear bad for the monolithic good and bad? How do you navigate that when you're kind of caught in between? How can you be a good human in this sort of really complex and violent setting?
Not against nuance. And I think it's very good to show the wider world who won't be reading the appendices, that there is all this detail and real understanding of the cost of war and the damage of war in Tolkien, and sense of damaged relationships. I mean, majority of his stories are that. But the frame around it is a belief in love, friendship, and courage.
Mhm.
Whereas if you
Yeah.
think of the frame around Succession, which is a great
Right.
piece of TV in its own right, but it set out with the premise that actually these things are either punished or don't survive or are not rewarded in this world, or don't, they are a plant in the wrong soil in the
Mhm.
world of Succession. So that's why I would be very sad if
Yeah.
it became too far on that way. The frame is shifted with a belief that this is what the Game of Thrones generation want to see, a sense of
Right.
everybody is equally bad. Everyone's
Yeah, the
bad.
bleak, yeah, reality, yeah, life is
We're all
bleak.
doomed.
Like,
Um,
and then you die. Yeah.
yeah. So anyway, we don't know, but we wait to see. But that's the kind of landscape they're working in. I I think that the most interesting part of it is to lean into the story of a woman in
Mhm.
Tolkien's world, because that's the untold story. You get glimpses of it, but by making the woman the central character, you've got a lot unwritten, because Tolkien he didn't work this up. It wasn't there. He could have had his own thoughts, but he didn't write them down. So they are able to do with this character here all sorts of things that will help even out the storytelling burden in Tolkien's world of how living through a war feels to primarily from the point of view of a woman. Fascinating
And where,
challenge.
yeah, yeah, and where there are bright spots within that record, because if you just read what Tolkien has in this little few page section in an appendix, is it's not there isn't anything really cheerful about this particular story that he has made
No.
explicit, right? All you have is Hammerhand, who who kills people with his hands, right? You don't even have the luxury, like the distance of a blade or even of a dagger. He's using his actual fists to kill people. And it said in there that the belief is if he didn't if he bore no weapon would bite him, is the language that's used. So like if he's not going to use a sword, then he can't be cut by a sword. That's kind of the popular belief that kind of grows out of here. But this is a guy who likes to get down and dirty with his hands. A cruel, just I mean not cruel, but a brutal fighter, right? So someone who's clearly like very aggressive. And so how do you and that's he goes out, I'm sure what they will include there in your kind of second act that you kind of laid out is him. He goes out by himself. So after his children die, so he has two, or not all of his children, right? His two sons, right? So one of his sons dies holding, like trying to hold the fort for the kingdom, and dies kind of like holding the door, and then he dies. But then a younger son, kind of as they're kind of stuck out in this area that becomes known as Helm's Deep, kind of during this long winter that you mentioned, Julia, that he kind of sallies out with a small group of people to try to attack the Dunlendings who had kind of sieged him there at Helm's Deep, but then he doesn't come back, so he dies, and so he's kind of so Helm is a father who is clearly, it says there that he's kind of growing gaunt and mad by the loss of his two sons. They could play with like how does that affect the daughter, right? The daughter's still there, presumably, right? But he's like mourning and just like so obsessed, kind of like you have with Faramir and Boromir, right? So two brothers, but a father who clearly loves one to the neglect of the other. that's a space that they could play with here. How does a daughter in this world, like you're mentioning, Julia, a woman in this landscape, how does she feel, right? We see it that kind of from Boromir's, from Faramir's perspective with the Boromir feeling loved. So as a child, how is that dynamic there? If she's not as aggressive, does the father not love her or pay much attention to her because she doesn't fit that same mold that he himself is in? But so you have this father figure who then kind of is driven mad by his mourning his sons and then goes out just by himself rampaging just on solo, and it says he's all dressed in white, so it's a stark image of him going out into the snow dressed in white where he says he looks like, like a snow troll. And then he sounds this horn, right? He lets them know, he lets the Dunlendings know that he's coming, blows that horn. So there's many like cinematic moments here, right? He's blowing this horn and then he just like goes out by himself, brutally, attacks, and then comes back. And then it says like if he, then they presume that he's looking for food while he's out there, and so the belief arises that if he didn't find actual food when he was out, because a part of the siege, everybody in Helm's Deep is hungry. If he couldn't find food, he's going to eat a person. And that's not
Yeah.
substantiated, but that's the tone of like we're getting this kind of filtered through, I think, in sense like the Dunlendings perspective and like their tradition that is held up, or that what the people of Rohan hear from the Dunlendings and then are kind of reporting that because it's said as a belief. So anyways, there's is just like there's a lot of brutality there, but then like you were mentioning, Julia, about this unnamed character who is also a woman being a point of view where we can kind of see through some of these, like by all intents and purposes from the outside could seem just like completely and utterly hopeless. Perhaps this is our kind of hobbit type character that kind of infuses it, that shows this world from a different perspective and can show us where, like Samwise, right, who kind of can see the flowers growing, right, the flowers growing on the statue of the king, that the king has a crown again, right. That's
Yeah,
not
and
something that Aragorn notices. He doesn't say like, "Oh, look, there's a patch of light, and this is so beautiful." But they take some of these other characters who aren't in positions of power to then kind of like reframe and change where our perspective is coming from.
I mean, if I was doing this, the journey for me would be that character of Hera learns to seize her own power. And because of the horses, I would make it around a love of horses and nature. And perhaps, you could have a sense of freedom and release if the Shadowfax of the day, the Miras of the day, allows her to ride them. Because only
Mm-hmm.
the kings of Rohan are allowed to ride them, and it would be a great moment if she gets to ride them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would also give her a love story that has um, some substance. And I would also make her a leader, a strong leader of her people, so that she has dignity within it, so that she's, as the brothers fall by the wayside and her father goes on this mad sort of lonely journey. I mean, I would have her stepping into that breach. Um, but well, let's see what they do. Let's see what they do. We'll leave them. We will come back once we've watched it and report and see what choices they've made. Just to sort of give you a few tiny little facts about Rohan, just to finish off. Um, you will have sort of seen in the film that their iconography and their language is Old English. And for Tolkien, everything in his book was a translation. And he said he chose to give them a form of Old English because that was their relationship to the common tongue, which is current English. Um, and it also explains why all the characters share the same letter: Helm, Harmer, Hera, because the tradition of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was to name their families after the same letter. So Alfred, Elfled. There was I think in Mercia, there was the Bede dynasty, which you can read about in the textbook. So it's a way of, there is a link here with those Old English civilizations, but the actual sort of seed of the horse lords is probably coming in from ideas of the the horse lords who used to ride in from the steppes into Europe. You know, there's that connection too. So there's a mingling of things going on to create the culture of the Rohirrim. And it'd be fascinating to see how this then becomes a visualized form in terms of what do they look like? What are they wearing? And do they look like Anglo-Saxon beowulf type characters? Is that how it's going to look? But we wait and see. So we haven't yet decided what our subject for where in all the fantasy world is the best place to be something, Jacob. But I think that in honor of the Rohirrim, we should decide where in all the fantasy worlds is the best place to be a horse lord.
Right.
I mean, other than Rohan,
Right.
because that's obviously a great place to
Yeah,
get the
yeah, which is
Leoras
the
and
best.
yeah.
Right.
So where would you like to ride a horse in which fantasy world would you think that would be most fun?
Phew. Um, well, to expand because it is fantasy and explicitly fantasy, I would take winged horses.
Oh, you're okay. You're breaking the rule. But carry on. Yeah,
So is that permissible
you're
in the
allowed. Off you
discussion of
go
fantasy?
then. Yeah.
Question. Yeah, I'm and one of the funnest horse characters that I appreciate is actually from Disney's Hercules, the
Oh yeah.
Pegasus character. Just the personality of the character, and so how that that interacts. And then you have Hades drives this like dark Pegasus character in a chariot. So that's fun. So you get to be Hades. So the world of Hercules, at least Disney's film Hercules, you have horses that can fly, and you have the option of a really dark underworld, being a horse lord of dark horses, or a really cheerful, almost dog-like in personality horse as your constant companion. So that's where I happen to be working with that uh property at work right now. So
Ah,
that's
it's
kind of where my head
expression. Yeah.
where my headspace is. So at the top of my head, that's where my head is. And yes, we'll go with I will go with right now the world of Disney's Hercules to be a horse lord of a Pegasus.
So I was thinking that one of my favorite sort of YA uh, fantasy writers is a writer called Tamora Pierce. So Tamora Pierce, in her series about Dane, who's a woman who has an affinity with animals, particularly with horses, and it's very detailed about the way she looks after horses. It's her series, which is called The Immortals. So that would be a great place to have that ability. It's not like telepathy with horses, but there's a instinct, like an animal instinct to know what other animals feel and communicate. It's very well done. So that's where I'd like to be a horse lord in that way, not a lord over them, but sort of with them, with the animals. So that's my pick. Thank you very much, and we wait with bated breath for the War of the Rohirrim to arrive in cinemas. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Mythmakers Podcast, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. Visit oxfordcentreforfantasy.org to join in the fun. Find out about our online courses, in-person stays in Oxford, plus visit our shop for great gifts. Tell a friend and subscribe wherever you find your favourite podcasts worldwide.